It's a personal pleasure for me to have co-convened this symposium with Frank. The ideas and ideals of Australia, the lucky country turned 60. And why is that? Well, 37 years ago, in 1987, I was a student in Donald Horne's MA course in Australian Studies at New South Wales University. He supervised my MA thesis, and I tutored for Donald for several years as well. There are many things that I recall about those years, but one anecdote, especially from the late 1980s, when I shared a meal one evening in an Asian restaurant on Anzac Parade with Donald and his good friend and colleague, Elaine Thompson, is particularly relevant to our symposium today, I think. As it did often with Donald, even when he wasn't trying, the conversation turned that evening to the lucky country. He suddenly announced, unexpectedly, to Elaine and myself, that he decided he wasn't going to talk about the lucky country again. At which point Elaine laughed and said, "You'll be talking about it until the day you die." Elaine, of course, was right. In his later years, Donald had a love-hate relationship with the book. Despite the book's runaway success, of which he was immensely proud, his ambivalence was explained by his determination not to be defined by one book, The Lucky Country. "I always want to keep my eyes on the book I'm writing," I can remember him saying to me, "on the book that's ahead of me, not the books behind me." 60 years ago, when Penguin published The Lucky Country, it captured an uncertainty about Australia's future as the country confronted rising consumption at home, war in Australia's north, and a world in which Australians couldn't really regard themselves as transplanted Britons any longer. Donald's pithy diagnoses condemned the complacency of the past at the same time as some of his chapter headings, What is an Australian?, Men in Power, Living with Asia, reflected the anticipation of a society on the brink of enormous change. I guess it'd be easy to imagine that a book written on the eve of a great transformation in Australian society, several transformations, by a journalist, author and academic, born shortly after the First World War, no longer has very much to teach us. But recently, we've been fortunate to see the publication of an award-winning biography of Donald by Ryan Kropp, and we're very, very fortunate too that we're delighted that he can join us today for the symposium. Perhaps when you look at The Lucky Country now, it was the ambition, the purpose and the method of the book, more than its actual content even, that speaks to us potentially now. Donald's was a society in which there was still a shared sense of a public sphere, one still dominated by white Anglo men, of course, but beginning to open up to more diverse influences. That pre-digital culture in which Horne operated, it had many faults and many frailties, and it was a world away from the guerrilla warfare of our media and cultural landscape today. Even at the time, in an era of ideological conflict, such as the Cold War, serious debate meant exploring differences, not accentuating them, just for the sake of that. Nor did Donald expect to find ideas only in one place or as the closely guarded property of one particular media, outlet or newsfeed. As Frank remarked yesterday at the Australian Studies Institute Australia in the World Symposium here, one purpose of our symposium over the next 2 days is to reinvigorate the tradition of the great generalisers, of which Horne belonged. That's a precondition, Frank wrote, for getting a better perspective on who we are and where we're going than our present public discourse seems able to achieve. Finally, of course, for all of you here, this won't be a surprise. We are taking the humanities seriously, and we hope that this will make, potentially, for a more civil discourse, more openness in the public domain to ideas that can be shared across different kinds of political commitment, and expand our sense of what's possible in terms of our national political ambitions and future vision for this country. And I think that's particularly pertinent after the failure of last year's referendum. And the humanities can and will, I hope, play an important role in truth-telling and in what is clearly a daunting task of charting a direction for this nation in a post-voice era. Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Mark. And on a personal note, I'd like to thank you for your collaboration. It's been an absolute delight working with you on this symposium. So, look, I'd like to invite the first panel to begin making their way up to the seats. Okay, so hopefully Shirley will be in. So, session one, Dream and Discontent. To begin setting the agenda for today, we have here four marvellous speakers. I shall go from the far right. I'm not suggesting for a moment, Ryan, that you're on the far right in any other sense, but there you are. Now, we've already heard, of course, about Ryan as a biographer, the biographer really, of Donald Horne, at least at book length at this stage. Ryan won the Prime Minister's Prize for that marvellous biography. He's working as a journalist here in Canberra and is, of course, a graduate of the University of Sydney. Next to Ryan, we have Julianne Schultz, who is, as everyone would know, a Professor Emeritus at Griffith University and was, of course, founding and long-term editor of Griffith Review, the author of many books on many aspects of Australian culture, including, I don't know if it's your most recent work, but The Idea of Australia, and, of course, a regular columnist in the Australian media. Next to Julianne, we have Graham Turner, Emeritus Professor Graham Turner. Graham, again, a major figure, of course, in cultural studies and Australian studies in this country, author of many works, former president of the Australian Academy of Humanities, and his most recent book is The Shrinking Nation. So all the things we've been saying about the generalisers of an earlier era and where have they all gone, well, we have a part of the answer. We have a number of them here today. So welcome to Graham. And finally, we have Marie Meredith, my good friend and colleague Marie from the University of Canberra. Marie is a proud Bijara woman and she's currently Pro-Vice Chancellor, Indigenous Leadership at the University of Canberra. And Marie has made an enormous impact in her leadership role at the University of Canberra in her time there, and absolutely delighted to have Marie with us today. And I believe Marie has another meeting fairly soon, so we'll probably have to leave after or soon after delivering your paper. So without further ado, I'll call on Marie, and I think we'll have how we might do this, I think, so Marie speaks first. If there are any questions, I think, for Marie, they could be directed to her, and then we'll move on to the other speakers and perhaps have a general, I think, discussion at the end of that period. So over to Marie. Thank you. Do you want to come up here? Great, thanks, Marie. Yeah, I'll swap with you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Frank. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I've been living and working on Annual Country for the last 18 months, but I have come back to Canberra. This is my third time back, and I'm a proud ANU graduate, so having this invitation today is like coming home. So I'm a graduate of the Masters in Applied Anthropology, and back in the day, back in 2010, I did my Masters under the tutelage of Professor John Altman. So I might kick off now, colleagues, and get straight into it. So Donald Horne's book, The Lucky Country, started a conversation that really has no end. The tendency for Australia to take its good fortunes for granted is ubiquitous now, as it was when Donald Horne wrote about it in the 1960s. Now, it seems to me to be as much a part of our national psyche as our actual physical distance from the hemisphere to the north. These twin characteristics in our identity, chance and distance, are both our strength and our weaknesses, and they have to be managed as such. It is a matter of striking a balance and maintaining it with vigilance and with open dialogue and deep listening for the sake of our communities from the local to the national level. That is why the Donald Horne's Lucky Country address is an opportunity for leaders to keep the conversation going by asking us to speak about our observations in our own field. For universities today, the pendulum of history has swung away from the feast of the past towards an ugly famine in the future if we fail to change the momentum. In order to do that, I'm here to say that a renewed national strategy is urgently needed. Indigenous Australians know what it is to be told that they have no social licence to operate. Clearly, the results of the 2023 voice referendum is proof of that. But there is a lesson in that experience for universities today who are being told by both sides of politics that their social licence to operate is past its use-by date. While Donald Horne's original audience in the 60s was white, male-dominated and conservative, the fact that I have been invited here to speak to you today shows how far we have come. But before we break out the party poppers, we must honour Horne's legacy in a sober assessment of where we have arrived. To keep things concise, we all know there is a small library of government reports to say that we still have not achieved equality of opportunity, of life expectancy, of wealth or health, or equality or representation for Indigenous people like myself, or for many others who would have not had a voice in the 1960s. But the fact that this is known, measured and consistently identified as a priority to address by governments of every persuasion shows that we have come a long way. But the question is, how do we continue to make significant progress towards equality? In the realm of the university sector, I believe we need to address our approach by adopting the principles of self-determination that characterises the resilience of so many Indigenous organisations. Australia's Indigenous people have a depth of experience in survival that is unique and enduring. And what we learnt during The Voice in 2023 was the importance of allyship. The 3% of Australians who are Indigenous deserve a say in our own future, but the reality is that we can't achieve that without the active support from other non-Indigenous allies. We can't make lasting change without bringing along a significant proportion of the 97%. In our newfound maturity, 60 years on from the publication of Lucky Country, and while keeping Donald Horne's definition of a fair go in mind, it is time to ask what are the organising principles, the underpinning values in the university sector. Are they part of a broader community that is enriched by a focus on merit and potential? How do we strengthen those principles and integrate them between the university and the community at large? Is giving everyone a fair go part of that strategy? Again, universities can learn from the Indigenous lived experience and knowledge, recognising the importance of community priorities, its potential and its needs, and using those to shape their own operations. At the University of Canberra, we call that the outside-in strategy, giving a voice and recognising the primacy of community priorities in shaping the work of the university. I believe the university sector, once the darling of the establishment and now, as I said, attacked by both sides of politics, can regain power over its own destiny by rebuilding its social licence through the implementation of outside-in strategies. In March 2024, the then Minister for Indigenous Affairs, the Honourable Linda Burney, launched our outside-in strategy at an event at Parliament House. Minister Burney spoke about the importance of strength-based strategies for First Nations people and the value of engaging community to identify and prioritise their needs and potentials. This is done by direct engagement through listening to and understanding what is being said. A community-led strategy does not mean that community will dictate the university's operational plan, but rather that we will listen and talk to university, identifying areas of alignments where we can add value and adopt our approach to enable better research, education and outreach outcomes. Intrinsic to this approach is that we will measure outcomes that matter to community and will report back to community. The model sounds simple, but it requires agility, humility, and a comprehension of nuance that many institutions choose to find too hard. And that difficulty, that resistance to change, compounded over time, may explain why the university sector is in such dire straits now. And yet the process can start with a simple decision to flip the existing university model upside down, repositioning the existing emphasis on executive managerial engagement to engagement within voices outside the ivory tower. I believe the crisis in the sector exists now to a large extent because the grassroots support that is our foundation has been badly neglected. It is the community rather than the executive that is fundamental to the success of any university. This means opening the doors to the community, both physically and intellectually, to provide space for the influence of new relationships, new dynamics, new ideas and new outcomes. These new relationships are essential to informing a self-determination agenda. What we learn from the voice is that this agenda cannot be progressed at the expense of others, that we should not abandon international students, nor fail to explain the value of students in education to the community. Nor should the sector sacrifice First Nations staff and students. We were promised a national First Nations review as a centrepiece of the Accord in February, and now that appears to be forgotten, competing with other priorities. But the luck or the lucky country has run out already. We are more aware of our inequality and more sorry for it, but our institutions are not prepared to prioritise fixing it. This cannot stand, and the time for change is now. We must transition to a post-luck culture where we actively choose to learn from lived experience, prioritise community, engage our allies and create an environment that allows and supports new thought leadership, a complete rethinking requiring a complete reconfiguration and reimagining of the purpose and meaning of the sector, perhaps beyond recognition, perhaps returning to a previous era when universities in range of influence and quality of outcomes were embedded in the life of the community in which they were physically located. We cannot allow ourselves to fall in the dichotomy of self-interest characterised by greed versus despair. We need to reframe our vision for Australia based around the collective priorities of community, building a future based on potential and not lament, justice and not retribution, equality and not platitude. The time has come to recognise this change to a stronger community where diversity of culture and heritage is leveraged to enrich perspectives and economies. This stronger, better vision of Australia is not going to spontaneously emerge, and nor will it be realised if government is left at the helm. Our richer democracy requires participation of the citizenry, not passive fealty to a benevolent house of rulers. Our richer democracy requires institutions to recognise that government is not equipped nor ready to lead change even while they are resourced and willing to facilitate it. Our richer democracy recognises that it is not just the capability but the responsibility of institutions such as universities and social responsible corporations to make change. But as we make that change, there needs to be a new recognition that sustainable change will only occur for Australia if we start to listen. The Universities Accord sets out a plan to enrol around 1 million additional students in tertiary education, with much of that growth coming from underrepresented groups, including Indigenous people, low SES, rural and remote, and people with disabilities. A fine ambition. But who has asked those million voices how they should like to study, what jobs they would like to do after graduating, and what the constraints are in simply getting to the door of campus? No one. The answer is there. No one is giving a voice to those million extra Australians, but in our benevolent wisdom, we are madly reconstructing our education system, expecting that they are just waiting for the campus door to open. The arrogance of our policy approaches, even when bearing noble intentions, continues to be our downfall. We need to elevate and listen to the new voices in the dialogue about the future of Australia, not just in relation to higher education, but across all sectors of our community. We must listen, but must also sift through an increasing tide of misinformation, driving polarisation of our communities, and reclaim the power of evidence and expertise, fundamental capabilities that universities excel in, but should not pretend to own. The possibility of reconstructing our new Australia, moving beyond luck to be crafted, intentional future based on evidence and consideration of the hitherto unheard, is a very exciting prospect. There are no signs that we can expect this reality to suddenly appear from government, but it can and should happen in our institutions. The principles of outside in, preferencing community priorities and shaping the way we operate must become more broadly adopted. Indigenous experience has shown us that through community control, real lasting effect change can occur. The voice proposal may have failed, but that just underscores the importance of seizing the opportunity to recognise the value of Indigenous knowledges and implement it with tangible results in the national institutions. The outside-in approach borrows from a deep history of collectivised interest and deep listening, honed over tens of thousands of years. It has remained a key organising principle for Indigenous organisations because it has stood the test of time. We can progress together to a future where self-determination in our geographic and social communities can deliver improved outcomes. But the change has to start with institutions, including those represented today. So colleagues, in closing, Donald Horne has gifted us with a lot. We owe it to him to be honest about how comprehensively we need to switch direction if we are to build a stronger future together.
Thanks so much to Professor Marie Meredith. I remember when, in the aftermath of The Voice, Marie, it was just what next, straight into it with you, and I must thank you again for your leadership. Shirley Lech, thank you. We're going to do questions immediately for Marie because Marie has to go to another meeting, and then I shall hand over to you. So I guess we'll just open up for questions. We've got a roving mic over here if anyone would like to ask Marie a question. Do you want to handle that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, you can go. Okay, so sorry. Was there a question? Oh, yes, just there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The lucky country has that word country in it, which Indigenous people now have given such a beautiful and sort of deeper meaning. I wonder if you might make some comment about that in terms of future directions.
Country, for me, brings in the holistic notions of health, that caring for country, learning from country means that we have to pay attention to not just the social, the physical, but also the economic and the emotional. And so for me, this gives us an opportunity to not just be in our disciplines, but to see it from a different perspective. And I think when we are in the institution, in the academies, the Indigenous knowledges and the uptake of that gives us an opportunity to see that perspective, that lateral perspective. I've spent about 20 years based in the Northern Territory. I worked for the land councils, and that's where I really first got to understand what it really means to care for country. And it is that experience that now informs my philosophy as a leader in the institution, that it is really important for us to embrace Indigenous knowledges. How we actually indigenise the curriculum is still a big task for universities to take on. We currently are looking at, post-voice, but what are RAPs doing for us just in terms of embedding those Indigenous knowledges. What I will say is that the buck needs to stop with our institutions. We really do need to start prioritising what I call the outside in, that it really is important for our Indigenous communities to be brought into the institution. We are grappling with issues of cultural load because we are a minority in the institution. So it is imperative that we bring our Indigenous knowledge holders that do care for country and do manage country, and that then know, how do we actually grow up the next generation of leaders. So they are principles that I like to embed in terms of my own philosophy, but it is so important that we start to look at how we start to indigenise the curriculum, and that's something that I'll be working towards as part of our new leadership strategy. But the outside in dictates that we've got to bring community in as part of that new body of work.
Thanks. Yeah. I think there was another question back there. Second question from... No?
I will be at the event tonight, so you can think about your questions, and over a glass of wine we can have a bit of a chat. So,
okay, last chance? No? Okay, another round of applause then.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. And our second speaker really needs no introduction, and I understand that Frank has already given a brief overview of our esteemed panel today. Dr. Ryan Kropp, of course, has written the book that we've all been reading avidly prior to coming to this conference today. So without further ado, please welcome Ryan Kropp to the podium.
Donald Horne was a social critic whose principal subject, bar a few notable exceptions, was Australia. The questions that animated him and a host of other writers, critics, journalists, and sometimes even politicians throughout the second half of the 20th century are basically the same as those we're here to discuss today. What are Australia's key social, cultural, and political divides? What ties Australians together? What separates them? What makes Australians one people? What is the image of an Australian? Horne often referred to this prolonged exercise in national introspection as the Australia discussion. It's often thought of as concerning questions of national identity and character, the search for some basic set of Australian qualities and characteristics that aggregate to a kind of national essence, or as Julianne put it in her recent book, a national soul. The discussion tends to take on a particular potency at all the key moments of civic ceremony and ritual. Australia Day, Anzac Day, debates surrounding the Indigenous voice to Parliament, Australian tours by members of the British royal family. As a whole range of scholarship has shown, the post-war iteration of this national self-absorption was largely set off by disputes over the shape and meaning of national symbols in the wake of British imperial decline. Things like attempts to change the national flag, to write a new anthem, to name a new currency, even to commemorate Australia's military history. My book on Donald had its origins in an honours thesis, looking at the manifestations of this state of the nation discourse in the world of Australian sport in the 1970s. The discussion of events as seemingly disconnected as anti-apartheid protests during a South African rugby tour and Australia's poor performance at the Montreal Olympics was infused with a sense of national crisis that in dispute was not merely Australia's sporting reputation, but some more profound truth about the country itself. The point, I think, is that for Horne's generation of writers and thinkers, the nation was perhaps the key prism through which to think about all varieties of political concerns. These questions were of interest not only to Horne, but to a significant degree the entire Australian political and media class for close to half a century, up to and including the 1990s and perhaps the 2000s. Now, these questions haven't gone away. Glance at the editorial pages of The Australian on any given Saturday, or listen to panel discussions at writers' festivals, and you'll often see debate over the same questions that energised Horne and co for so long. What I want to suggest today is that over the past few decades, debates over the state of the Australian nation, at least as they relate to the problem of defining an Australian essence or an idealised image of the country to present to a foreign audience, these debates have lost some of their purchase on the broader public discourse. The discussion is still there, but it seems to lack some of the existential urgency of days gone by. When these debates do occur, there seems to be a sense of exhaustion, of going through the motions. To borrow a line from The Lucky Country, it's like watching two old politicians conducting a debate they had read about in an old book. This exhaustion was evident in the complaints I heard from several of my press gallery colleagues during King Charles' recent visit to Australia, when they announced with a kind of bored resignation that they'd been asked by their editors to write something about Australian republicanism. What else is there to say? Now, I know it's possible to take issue with the premise here, that these questions have always been intellectual abstractions, and that the orgy of national self-criticism that took place in Horne's day was never something that engaged the imagination of Joe Blow on the street. To quote one prominent critic sitting in the front row, the whole national identity charade might simply have been a hall of mirrors occupied by Horne, Manning Clark, and a handful of newspaper leader writers. But even if that was so, it didn't stop Prime Ministers from Holt to Howard attempting to give some shape to the national image, to find some language of shared social experience that could tie the nation together in modern times. Nor did it stop waves of scholars dropping the national frame over any and every field of study, the so-called Australia and books. It's worth noting too that Horne's own relentless stream of State of the Nation books sold in pretty decent numbers, certainly numbers that I'd be happy with. The Lucky Country, meanwhile, famously remains in print 60 years after publication. Australia still produces these books and still has these debates. A few of my fellow panellists here have written some very interesting and probing State of the Nation books of their own. But I think it's fair to say there's increasingly a kind of indifference to such questions. An indifference, granted, that's always kind of been there, but it seems to have become more pronounced in recent times. One reason for this, I think, is that the media landscape and the boundaries of our collective political imaginations have evolved in ways that are at once bleedingly obvious and rather subtle. To put it simply, over the last 20 years, the way we consume information has radically changed. During his time as editor of the Bulletin in the late 1960s and early 70s, Donald Horne had a standing Friday lunch booking at a restaurant near the Bulletin office, where he and a gaggle of the magazine's staff, contributors, and other hangers-on would discuss current events over a meal, accompanied by a bottle of wine, or three. But as many of the members of this weekly news salon told me, there were some unspoken rules, the most important of which was that to participate in the conversation, you had to have read pretty much all of the previous week's newspapers and news magazines cover to cover. On the surface, there's nothing particularly unusual about this. What stands out to me now, though, in the context of this discussion, is the assuredness with which these cultural elites and tastemakers could consume a select variety of media and know that they had gotten their heads around all or most of the key issues of the day, and more to the point, that they could confidently assume that what they had read in those newspapers was the same thing that most ordinary Australians had read when they picked up identical copies of those newspapers. There was a presumed shared understanding of the political issues of the day, and one that largely corresponded to reality. Even a few decades later, when Paul Keating and John Howard were having debates over the national character on the floor of the Australian Parliament, mobile phones barely existed. The internet didn't really exist at all. News and information was still largely funneled through major legacy mediums: radio, a handful of major print publications, print newspapers, about 4 television stations, a comparatively broader array of periodical print publications and magazines, plus a somewhat healthier book publishing industry. Now in 2024, things look very different. I'm nowhere near the first person to point out that since almost all of our communications have become digital, large parts of our news consumption has become beholden to algorithms. Algorithms that know no national boundaries. We shouldn't underestimate the impact that this digitisation of information distribution has had on the shape and contours of our public debate. The point I want to make, though, is that as newspapers are slowly replaced by news feeds, the idea of the nation as one of the predominant forms of shared experience and group loyalty is relentlessly undercut by so many other competing claims. In such an environment, the imagined community of the nation is harder to sustain. The sense of an agreed set of public issues, the imagined public square that was so obvious to Horne and his peers in the 1970s, does not seem so obvious to me now. I think this change also has a generational aspect. Younger people are much more predisposed to consume information through the new channels, and much less predisposed to do things like buy a newspaper. They basically don't buy newspapers, or watch the 7 p.m. news bulletin. Young Australians have come of age during a period of hyper-globalisation, when more so than perhaps any other point in history, things like economics, the environment, and even health can be dictated by forces well beyond the state itself. Climate change, the GFC, and the COVID pandemic were all political shocks of the global age. Is it such a surprise that young people are at best ambivalent about the idea of an Australian Republic, or unconcerned more generally with Australia's national character and image? Slowly, and then all at once, those forces of globalisation and digitisation have undercut prior forms of group loyalty, of which the nation was one. The boundaries of our political imaginations have shifted, even if our nationally bounded political institutions have not. So, what is to be done? A pessimist would say not much. Short of radically overhauling the business models of the big tech platforms, we're all condemned to continue producing content for the machine, locked into our silos, perpetually outraged and misunderstood. An optimist, though, someone like Donald Horne, might point out that ideas still have the power to captivate. When the algorithm gets hold of a big idea, it can turbocharge it to an extent previously unimaginable. In this mood, I sometimes think what's missing isn't so much a return to a traditional centralised media environment, although this will certainly continue to be a major problem for democratic politics, but rather a more compelling explanation for why the world is the way it is and how we might change it. Horne called this the art of political criticism. Good political criticism had the power to bring coherence to the muddle of reality, to give it a shape and a meaning that was comprehensible to ordinary people. Horne was a great phrase maker. He thought that memorable phrases had the ability to remake reality, provided they gave shape to the reality of contemporary experience and crystallised what was already in people's minds. Most importantly, Horne thought that such criticism, when it appeared, provided not only a new view of reality, but a framework for political action. Now, Horne was obviously speaking from experience. Few Australian phrases have been as memorable or as impactful as the lucky country. At a transitional moment for the country, he identified a dissatisfaction with the direction of events and a restlessness about the future. And perhaps serendipitously, he gave it a name. Now, I'm not sure a choice phrase or a probing book is going to revive the energy of the Australia discussion in 2024. But perhaps that's the point. Our experience of the world has changed. Good political criticism needs to find a way to describe it. The problems that preoccupied Horne haven't entirely gone away. The concerns of his era, environment, geopolitics, race, gender, sexuality, remain highly relevant today. But other political divides too have either emerged or become more pronounced. Educational disparities have become one of the great societal rifts, as have suburban, outer suburban, and rural differences. And increasingly, questions of economic inequality are becoming fundamental, as embodied in the absolute insanity of the Australian housing market. The role for the humanities here is what it has always been, as an ideas factory, telling new and more convincing stories about what is happening and why. In the lucky country, Horne observed an Australian indifference to ideas and intellectual life. But he also speculated that it may not have been ideas themselves that Australians detested, but simply the ideas that had been presented to them. In an oft-quoted passage from the book, he argued, "Most Australian writers seem to find it impossible to come to grips with their own people. They caricature their fellow countrymen or idealise them for qualities most of them do not possess. There is no Australian Orwell, searching for the temper of the people, accepting it, and moving on from there. The world can seem an impossibly complex place, but movements for change start first as ideas. It's when those ideas seem compelling to people and are taken up and championed by leaders that change can happen." Thanks.
Thanks, Ryan. And our second speaker also really needs no introduction to this audience. Professor Julian Schultz is one of the leading public intellectuals in Australia, and is one of the leading public intellectuals in Australia, and of course we've all read her book as well. And I understand it's being made into a television series, which is great news. So please join me in welcoming Professor Schultz to the stage.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this university is built. I would like to start by just reflecting on how the difference between 1964, when The Lucky Country was written, and 2024, when we are now. They are profoundly different times in human history, in the nature of this country, in the nature of the world. But I also think that they are there's probably a parallel, or at least a similarity, that we can sort of grapple with, at least in this seminar, that I think that they are both sort of hinge years. They're years at which we can apprehend that there was fundamental change coming. You couldn't be quite sure what it was, but there was a sense of momentum. And I must say that as watching the events, I mean, particularly culminating with the election of Donald Trump last week in the United States, but the events that have been building over the last few years, it feels very much like we are at one of those hinge moments in global history. We don't know where that election in the United States is going to lead the world, but we can be pretty sure it's not going to be where we've been in the past. I think that everything that has been said as a part of that election campaign and the appeal that it had to the American public suggested that the old models weren't working or didn't appear to be working to the satisfaction of the American people. And Trump's analysis of what that needs to do is to basically throw out much of the established pattern of global relations that we have lived with since the end of the Second World War. It's been a sort of, for all its flaws, and I'm not making great claims for the perfection of the system, but for all its flaws, it's been a system which has been based on a shared sense of global laws. It's been a system which has evolved with a sense of rights being possible for nations, for people, quite widely dispersed, and for that to be increasingly articulated and acted upon. I think everything that Trump says is that he wants to throw that out. And what that means for a country like Australia is going to be really something quite difficult for us to grapple with, because we've become, I think, quite complacent, and, you know, Australia has flourished in this sort of environment one way or another. So I think that if we think about the 2 years, that is 1964 and 2024, that we can see that they are both moments of enormous potential change where we don't quite know where it's going to lead. And I think that's very much a message that comes through in Horne's book. He's sort of diagnosing, he's talking about situations, he's grappling with problems, but he didn't really know where it was going to lead. He certainly didn't know that, you know, couldn't really have anticipated the transformation of Australian society, economy and life that occurred in the couple of decades, or 3 decades really, after that period. He certainly couldn't have anticipated that by 1989, once Australia had completely embraced a sort of model of market economics, what he called economic fundamentalism, that we would then go into another phase where things would be completely upended. And the nature of the society that was known in 1964 was profoundly changed as the embrace of a sort of market-led economics really started to eat into the fabric of the society in really fundamental ways. So just as a sort of reminder, and I know there are a lot of historians here who know this a lot better than I do, but I think it's just worth just doing a quick recap of what was happening in 1963-64. It was a period, and I guess that one of the starting points is the book that Horne wrote in 1964, published 1964, wrote in late 63, was one that was directed at a country of Australia which had a population of 11 million people. 5 million of that 11 million people were under 21. It was an incredibly young society. It was a society that had been, you know, the population was growing partly as a result of migration and as a result of the sort of baby boom, you know, in that period, in that post-war period. So 2/5 of the population were under 21 when that book was first published. That's another difference from now, of course, because now it's obviously a much older society. But it's a really important thing just to bear in mind as to part of the reason why that book had a sort of an echo that went on for so long. I mean, I remember I was a child, and I remember a young child in 1964, but I remember my parents reading it. I remember my mother reading it and being absolutely engaged by it. So I think that there was a sort of generational thing that happened in that process. So 1964, obviously the key big economic thing is that Britain is starting to jettison the sort of the colonies. You know, its trading focus moves to Europe. And that causes a profound disruption in the sort of economic system because most Australian trade was with Britain. I always tell this story, it's slightly out of sequence in what I'm talking about now, but I'll tell it anyway because it's such a good line. When Dan Tehan, as the former Minister for Trade, signed the free trade agreement with the UK in 2022 or whenever it was, he said, 2021 it must have been, he said, this right's a historic wrong. For somebody like Dan Tehan, whose family were farmers in central Victoria, their world was turned upside down by that change of British trading models. For him, you know, several decades later, he feels he's righting historic wrong by signing a free trade agreement with a diminished Britain. I mean, it's all a bit wacko, but there you go. That's the nature of Australian politics. But other things that were happening, I mean, some of the other things that were really important, I think, were happening was that there was a really building sense of sort of national identity in terms of change, of what people wanted to happen. You'd seen the sort of movement that came especially out of the universities in terms of opposition to the White Australia policy. That was really, you know, hitting its strides in that period. The movement for Aboriginal rights was really something that was generating enormous momentum. As Claire Wright writes in her book, almost every day in the Parliament, a petition was being presented to change the Australian Constitution, not just to remove the race powers of the Constitution, but to recognise First Nation, or what we call now First Nations people. That was something that was happening underground, but was galvanising huge amounts of support, or increasing amounts of support. 1962, for the first time, Aboriginal people had been given the right to vote in Australia. The civil rights movement, obviously, in the US was an inspiration, but I think also that growing sense of sort of national identity and assertion came as people like Horne and many others travelled, spent time in the UK and found that it was not a country that they felt particularly comfortable with. It wasn't a country that was really their home, that they'd been brought up to believe it was. It was difficult in the post-war environment, it was rigid, it was stuffy, you know, all the things that we know, but that came, as Ryan writes this beautifully in his book about Donald, came as a shock when confronted with it. Rupert Murdoch, similarly, studying at Oxford, can't abide the English, can't abide Britain, modern Britain as it appeared in those post-war years. So I think that gave an impetus back here to say, well, actually, we're not just a shadow, we're not just children of the mother country, we're something else. We've got to try and assert that. And of course, that plays into a sort of global movement that was happening at the time of the sort of whole decolonisation process, and nations all around the world both emerging and asserting a sense of national identity. I don't think Australian discussion was ever really properly put into that context, but if you look at it globally, it's very difficult not to see this as part of that movement. So now we're obviously in a world which is, as I said, completely different to that, one in which we are utterly integrated in the global economy, where the old Australian model of a sort of public-private parallel economic system, where you have public enterprises and private enterprises operating across the sphere in almost every industry sector, has long gone. And we're much more locked in, as Ryan has said, into the sort of daily news cycles and information that's going around in the world. It's a much more amorphous sort of context. One of the other things, of course, that happened in this same period was that this is also the 60th anniversary year of the Australian. And you've probably noticed at various points, if you haven't been able to avoid it, the Australian celebrations of its 60th anniversary endlessly. But part of what they've done, and part is a benefit of the digitalisation process, is that they've been able to reprint a lot of stuff that was published in 1964. And it's actually really interesting to go back and read what the debates were, what the interests were, what the issues were that were animating people. And to just get a sense, I mean, also how rough and ready it was, but to get a sense of just what was happening, you know, at that time, you know, in terms of what was then the sort of pinnacle of, you know, one of the pinnacles of places of public discussion. Because, of course, what had happened in the lead up to the establishment of the Australian was that there'd been a lot of those emergent publications. There was The Observer, there was the CIA-backed Meanjin, CIA-backed Quadrant. Sorry, are you sitting there, Esther? I'm channeling you. But there was a lot of vibrant debate in that public space, you know, with publications of all different hues and with different levels of public support and other external support being there. So the Australian, in a way, channels that in what happens in 1964. The most interesting thing, I think, that was said during the anniversary of the 60th anniversary of the Australian was by Lachlan Murdoch, when he said that the Australian had changed Australia. Australia was a very different place as a result of the Australian than it would otherwise have been, he said. Now, his father, in starting the publication, wanted to change Australia. He wanted to make it much more dynamic, much more independent, much more engaged with the world. What Lachlan was talking about was a very different change. And he said if Australia had remained a place where the just looking at the time, where the ABC was a dominant media company, it would be a very different place. And you could only say, yeah, I think that's right. It would be a very different place. It would probably be a whole lot better place, but let's just put that to one side. So I think that one of the things that I'm really sort of interested in is what echoes you get from the book. And I'm just going to read you a little bit from the beginning of the book, which I was reminded of in preparing for this, because I think that it's a little quote which I think applies with such sharpness now that it's worth hanging on to. And he says, and I'll go from... Australia merits sympathy for providing... Australia merits sympathy for providing an encyclopedic study of the main dilemmas of the mid-century. Until it has much greater strength, and ultimately that would seem to depend on a huge increase in population, there is nothing much we can do about some of its problems, except hope for the best. But it moves very slowly in doing anything about any of its problems. There are no great debates, there is little effective public discussion. The men in power do not seem able to excite first their own imaginations and then those of others into becoming familiar with these challenges. The government does not seem capable of getting a far from incompetent bureaucracy on the move. There are a few new men gathered together in the precincts of power to revisualise the images of the nation so that change may become possible. The men at the top, the tribal leaders, are not in training for such a set of awkward situations. Their imagination seems exhausted by the country's achievements. Their own ideals, those of a more modest and earlier Australia, have been met, and there are those people to whom they will listen and to tell them that those ideals are now obsolete. Those who are now successful hold conventional wisdom that belonged to the first chapter of Australian history, a chapter that finished somewhere in the mid-20th century. There is no longer in Australia a generally accepted sense of a future. Now, I thought that is really a phrase and that sort of description of a lack of imagination, that they've exhausted themselves by the success of their own achievements, that really, for me, resonates with the situation that we're in now. And we see it in terms of the responses to the big issues of the day, you know, climate change, education, inequality, tech, and so on. That the solutions are essentially ones of tinkering with what's there. Developing another KPI, put another patch on the problem, see if this will hold together long enough before you move on to the next thing, rather than actually going back and saying, what is it you really want to imagine that this island continent at the bottom of the Southern Oceans might be, could be and should be? I mean, I take Ryan's point about the nation no longer being an active organising principle, but my argument is that it's the only one we've got, and that everyone comes from somewhere, and that somewhere we happen to be from is here. And so we've got an obligation, in a sense, to engage with that very actively, to know the history better, to see what we can apply from that, and to find hopeful pathways forward, to actually push that imagination. I think that everything in the political system as it exists now makes that almost impossible for politicians to do. Almost impossible. We saw that during the Voice campaign, that the reality of how politics are conducted doesn't leave that space. But on the ground, we see there's this enormous amount of energy. There's a huge energy. I mean, there's nearly 6.5 million people who, despite all the shit that was thrown at the public during that Voice campaign, all the dishonest half-truths, all the rewriting of Australian myths so that fairness becomes something that means that they get something I'm missing out on, all that still left nearly 6.5 million people, and a whole bunch of people who thought afterwards that they should have voted yes, they realised they made a mistake. It leaves that 6.5 million people looking for somewhere to go, looking for a place where their energy and their optimism and their confidence about something being done can become a reality. So there's a really good groundswell of people, but finding a way of channeling that into the political system which has been captured by the right and has been, in which people have been paralysed by the environment in which they operate is really a huge challenge. Now, as I said at the beginning, Horne didn't really anticipate that the transformations that would occur in Australia in the next 2 decades after he wrote this book would occur. I can only say that I sort of hope that we know more. We know that there are at least, 6-7 million people in this country who actually actively aspire to do something which is bolder than what we're currently doing, and that finding the pathways to activating them is really a challenge for all of us and many others. Now, that's an unfair challenge because the humanities are under such assault. You are all under such tremendous pressure in your daily work and your lives that asking you to do more is sort of unfair. But holding that flame just seems to me is absolutely the kernel of the absolute responsibility, in a sense, for those of us who've been put in a position to learn and study and know both what's happening here and elsewhere over a long, long time, going right to deep time to future looking. And so we've sort of got an obligation to do it. And I think that was one of the things about Horne. He felt an obligation to the country that had given him the opportunities that he had, and I share that. So thank you, and I'm happy to discuss these ideas in much further detail as we go on over the next few days. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think there's so much in there that we're going to unpack in the question and answer session. But we'll move straight on to Emeritus Professor Graham Turner's paper. Again, Graham is one of the leading public intellectuals of our age in Australia at this time. And I also personally am a huge fan of the title of his book. It makes me laugh every time I read it. The Shrinking Nation. I always think of that movie, you know, Honey, I Shrunk the Nation, every time I see it. So without further ado, please welcome Graham to the podium.
That's interesting. I haven't thought of that title as being comical before. I'll now never be able to think of it the same way again. So The Lucky Country is the most iconic of our catalogue of State of the Nation books. More than any other, it's become a part of the thing that it set out to describe. Over the years, its opinions and observations have been used both to challenge and to reproduce some of the established assumptions and mythologies about Australia's national character and values. Of course, these are terms which have been contested, much contested. Speaking about the national character or Australian values is entirely entangled with the partisan politics of the times. These days, rather than marking points of general recognition and assent, they've generated opportunities for motivated intervention and division. We can't talk about the national culture so generally or so confidently as Donald Horne did in 1964. We are not that kind of nation anymore. Clearly much has changed since 1964, structurally and politically. Australia is less demographically homogeneous, less white, less youthful, less Anglo, and perhaps slightly less masculinist. All good as far as that goes, but there are other changes that are less progressive. Social inequality is greater than it was in the 1960s. Our politics have become more short-term and tribal. Closing the gap still hasn't happened. And the standards of conduct in politics and government have been on a downward slide since at least the early 2000s. Some indicators, such as the Scanlon Report on Social Cohesion, suggest that our citizens are facing a crisis in belonging and that we are less of an inclusive, just and equitable national community than we used to be. The Lucky Country provided us with an account of something like a common culture. I doubt if we could picture our culture quite like that today, for a whole variety of reasons, many of which simply weren't around in 1964. I believe there's a question as to what extent, in recent years, the idea of the nation has been able to function as an effective device for calling up an inclusive, imagined community to which all Australians can, or indeed might wish, to claim membership, or to which they might experience a sense of belonging. There are numerous places where we might look to find the reasons for this. The two I want to focus on in this presentation are the role of a transformed media landscape and the diminished culture of the federal politics. Both are fundamental to the cultural construction of the nation, and they've played a crucial part in refashioning the ways in which we now imagine the national community. Much of the consequences of that refashioning has been destructive, serving to undermine our citizens' confidence in and the legitimacy of the idea of the nation and its place in our collective imagination. So let's start with what was for many years the standard work on the idea of the nation, Benedict Anderson's The Imagined Communities. There are multiple factors at play in his analysis of the origins and spread of nationalism over the last 2 centuries, but one that has been often noticed is his emphasis on the role of the print media. Anderson claims that the arrival of the novel and the newspaper in the 18th century produced, quote, 2 forms of imagining, unquote, which, again quoting, provided the technical means for representing the kind of imagined community that is the nation, unquote. Anderson suggests that the newspaper had a particular resonance, partly due to its daily ubiquity on the newsstand, in the bus, on the train, in the home. The newspaper is a physical as well as a representational means of reassuring its reader that their imagined community, as he put it, is visibly rooted in everyday life. It's the newspaper, with its vernacular languages and quotidian availability, which takes nationalism from the intellectuals to the populace. Those influenced by Anderson's history subsequently broadened its focus to include the mass media in general, and in particular television, which eventually took over as the medium most customarily implicated in discussions of the mass-mediated socio-cultural construction of the nation. Television was the place where the nation represented itself and where its conversations about itself most accessibly took place. But as the power and influence of the mass media has contracted, and as we have entered a globalising post-digital era where the idea of a common or indeed a national culture has lost much of its purchase, things are very different. There are now serious concerns about the social and cultural function of these media systems as they appear to have relinquished their traditional interest in accurately informing our citizens, in holding power to account, and in fostering a sense of belonging to the national community. There are some obvious issues to point to here. The acceleration in the flow of so-called information has outstripped the citizen's capacity to assess its legitimacy or validate its sources. At the same time, the rising tide of information has been aggressively polluted by the spread of misinformation and disinformation, the rise of truthiness, and the failure of strategies such as fact-checking to act as an effective corrective, allowing the online environment to become a virtual Wild West, freed from the corporate and personal responsibilities or social norms that civilised behaviour offline, turns out to have been a serious mistake. As the balance of power swings away from a nationally regulated mass media towards a transnational unregulated online media, it has supercharged a fundamental shift in the media's dominant business model, both online and offline, where once that business model might have depended in varying ways and to varying extents upon the media outlet's status as a trusted source of information, now it's overwhelmingly dependent on the ability to, on a good day, entertain, but on many others, to provoke, enrage or alarm. The media's primary strategic objective today is the attraction of attention. The surest way to achieve that objective is to generate anger, fear or resentment, what Malcolm Turnbull has called angertainment. I'm sure he's very proud of that. Of course, this didn't just start with the digital media. The mass media was already failing us before social media came along. Eric Beecher's recent History of Media Moguls, The Men Who Killed the News, presents us with a rogues gallery of newspaper proprietors who have abused their power. These men exploited what Beecher described as, quote, the gigantic loophole in democracy that protects the freedom of the press without requiring any ethical, moral or societal responsibility from its owners, unquote. His lineup of those who have exploited this loophole includes William Randolph Hearst, Robert Maxwell, Conrad Black, Silvio Berlusconi and the mogul's mogul, Rupert Murdoch. But the digital era has taken this exploitation to another level, driven by the new media moguls, arguably with even less of a moral compass, Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. A shiver goes down the spine now when we use that name of Elon Musk and thinking about the future. Beecher's loophole has played a major role in the degradation of the culture of politics in Australia. That degradation has been facilitated by a significant erosion in the levels of ethical and social responsibility now observable in much of the performance of political journalism in particular. The disinteresting calling out lies and untruths rather than blithely disseminating them, the cynical use of the alibi of objectivity to create what is called false balance, the beating up of faux controversies generated around the person rather than the investigation of policy, the coverage of politics as a sport or a game, These are damaging and pervasive tendencies in journalism practice that may have long been around at the bottom end of the tabloid print media, but which have become more or less standard practices right across the media landscape in the current era. What is particularly notable, and something that's a comparatively recent shift in Australia, is that the behaviour of the political journalists has changed as they have moved closer to the flame. No longer content to act as watchdogs on the behalf of the public, some of today's most influential political journalists have come to promote themselves as active players in the game of politics. No longer independent observers and analysts, they have become participants. The consequent reduction in the provision of independent scrutiny and analysis has sidelined issues of accountability and the task of holding power to account. It's little wonder then that the current standards of national governance have sunk so low, and that the level of trust our citizens have in many of our institutions has followed suit. As a pointer to all that is rotten in this domain, let me give you just one word: robo-debt. As the likely resonance of that word would suggest, however, it's our politicians themselves who have done the most to undermine the trust in and the perceived legitimacy of our institutions of government. They have displayed a determined resistance to accepting accountability, political responsibility, or the need for transparency. In search of occasional political advantage, they have been prepared to launch the most cynical attacks on our publicly funded scientific and cultural institutions. At various points, they have chosen to reject the expertise of the CSIRO and other scientific and medical authorities, and they have refused to meet with experts capable of guiding national policy on natural disasters and environmental risk. While waging the long-running culture wars, they have consistently bullied an ever more risk-averse ABC and pounced on any member of the glam sector foolhardy enough to raise their head above the parapet of government cultural policy. Expertise has been treated as a threat to be extinguished, and individuals or institutions who represent competing sources of authority are recklessly attacked. In what is probably the most significant structural shift, the politicisation of the public service, with the inevitable consequences for disinterested advice and effective governance, has now been proceeding for something like 3 decades. In one of her quarterly essays, Laura Tingle suggested that our governments appear to have forgotten how to govern. My take on this, actually, is that they're just not that interested. Politics has been repurposed, so it is now more about the securing of power than using that power to govern in the national interest. The performance of politics has itself become the central activity for all politicians, for those in power as well as for those seeking to displace them. Good policy, well-informed legislation, governing in the national interest and for the public good are all casualties of this brand of politics. Where does that leave the public good and the national interest if we can't rely on the media or our political institutions to place this in the foreground any longer? Underpinning the proper functioning of the imagined community of the nation is the confidence that somewhere there must reside the responsibility for national well-being, or at least the scrutiny that would call to account those who fail to meet that responsibility. That confidence, the confidence in the fundamental centrality of the national interest and the public good, is now in short supply. The lucky country then, as a generalising aphorism, seems now to describe another country. We are in a very different place now. This is a national community that is weary of its fractured political landscape, frustrated at the failure of its political class to act decisively and responsibly on the challenges we face, socially divided by decades of cynically confected culture wars, and beset by the widening gaps in opportunity and resources created by the years of neoliberal policy settings and a bipartisan reluctance to address the long-standing failures in social justice around gender, race and class. Now, our session title is Dream and Discontent, and I guess it's pretty clear I'm addressing the discontent side of that pair. This is a nation in need of reimagining, politically, socially and culturally. On current settings, given the account I've just presented, creating the imagined community 2.0 seems as if it will have to be done without the assistance of the media or the political class. Like the resilient and resourceful Australians so routinely left by the state to deal with the consequences of unforeseen natural disasters, we will have to find ways of doing this for ourselves. That's a task for which the humanities, even though we have become collateral damage at times ourselves, this is a task for which the humanities are well equipped, and it's a challenge we should embrace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. Now we have the privilege of actually having a reasonably good amount of time for questions and for discussions. So I would like to just take the opportunity to ask the first question, and it's actually of Ryan. I think you briefly touched on this notion of Australia as an information taker, not an information maker, in terms of its place in the international, particularly social media, I guess, environment. And I wondered if you might want to enlarge on that a little bit, on that point.
I'm not entirely sure that's what I argue.
Okay. What did you argue then, in terms of the algorithm-driven?
My argument was very vibes-based and impressionistic, in the spirit of Donald Horne. A lot of anecdotal evidence. But I'm hung up on this point of how much time I and other people I know spend on their phones and on social media apps and these kinds of things, and how what that does to the way I think about the world, and especially people younger than me who kind of have just grown up in this situation, who spend their entire life on TikTok or whatever. Like, this is the only information they consume, and I just contrast that with older Australians who still care about a lot of these questions, and I just that was kind of where I was coming from, basically, right? That, like, I was trying to figure out why the ambivalence, and I just think that when we haven't properly comprehended the impact that this digital transformation has had on the way we think about the world, right? But that is the biggest change of the last 20 years. And any kind of comprehension of how the world, about why it is the way it is, has to kind of begin there, I think, because it structures our everyday existence and the way we think and consume information.
Thanks, Ryan. So I think we have a microphone over there. So we've got a question right at the back here.
Hello, yes. Warwick Anderson from the University of Sydney and the University of Melbourne. Thanks for that very illuminating panel. I think there's one issue that for me remains in the shadows, and that's the whiteness of Donald Horne's Australia. To be provocative, I wonder whether one could regard the lucky country as an example of the long-term, complicity of the humanities in Australia in the white nationalist project. So I wonder to what extent it's an example of what might be called a white man's dreaming. And the fact that we may have lost that white man's dreaming, at least that particular version, may perhaps explain some of the issues that have been mentioned in trying to retrieve an organic understanding of the nation.
Who would like to pick that one up?
I will. Look, I think that's absolutely right about lucky country. I mean, it is, and it's really striking when you realise the extent of the growing awareness of the issues of settlement in terms of Aboriginal Australia, that was around at the time that he was writing it. And it's just interesting, for instance, to juxtapose the rereading of The Lucky Country with Claire Wright's new book on the Yirrkala bark petitions. And one of the real strengths of Claire's book is to document how active that civil society movement was in actually trying to upend those old, that old invisibility, So I don't think you can make, there's no excuses that can be made about Donald. I mean, he missed a huge thing that was actually happening on the ground in the country at the time, and it's just not there. I mean, in the prologue, he writes about meeting people, I forget which country it was, in that sort of whip around the world, whip around Asia, that he does it in the first couple of pages. And people are saying, well, you have treated your native people very badly. And he says, oh, well, we're giving them rights or something, because it was like the year that voting had just become a possibility. So it wasn't as though he was completely unaware of it, but it was just not integrated into his thinking at all in that book. And I think that's very typical of men of that generation. If you look at other white publications of the time, The Nation, at the sort of more progressive side, The Observer, a whole bunch of them. And except for people like Lockwood and people like that, there wasn't much writing that was happening that was actually connecting with a mainstream Anglo-white audience. It was just the invisibility. And I mean, that's obviously, something which has now profoundly changed and will never go back.
Any other comments from the panel?
I guess another way to think about Julianne's point there about those conversations Horne was having while he was writing the book is that race was a huge part of his thinking. It was, in fact, I think he thought the driver of, or the reason why Australia needed to change so much, right? That Australia was cut adrift. Britain had abandoned us. Now we need to kind of have a relationship with these Asian nations, and we're this white man's country, the poor white man of Asia. And so, whether or not it was a moral question or not, it was pragmatic, right? Australia needed to become a more pluralist, diverse, inclusive society. It was kind of fundamental to his thinking with the Lucky Country, I think.
There's no question about that in relation to the engagement with Asia, and I think that's the other thing which is sort of interesting in that prologue, is that the people he's speaking to in the Philippines and Thailand and everywhere else he was travelling was saying, oh, this white Australia policy is a real problem for us, and it was still extant. It was very much extant in 1963, and for people of his generation, as Mark was making the point yesterday, he's born 2 decades after Federation. I mean, Federation foundationally entrenches white Australia. It doesn't do it in the Constitution, but it does it in the first 3 acts of Parliament. And I mean, the great enduring thing I used to say I don't understand the silencing that happened about the wars of settlement. I didn't understand how in the years before Federation there could be parliamentary inquiries into mass slaughters of Aboriginal people, that there could be novels written that were bestsellers about the role of the native police in Queensland, and you get to the Federation process and they are a dying race that have just disappeared. I couldn't understand how that silencing happened, that people could go, people who are engaged in the discussion could go from being knowledgeable that bad stuff was happening and that they were complicit in it to being completely able to wipe it out of their heads. That's what I used to think. The silence that has accompanied the response to the referendum last year has shown me that we are as capable of doing that now as they were 120 years ago.
Yeah, the great forgetting. Yeah. All right, next question up the front here.
Great. Thank you very much to all our speakers. I'm Stephen Wilkes from the ANU School of History. Not surprisingly, this is going to be an historian's question. I'm conscious of the fact that Donald Horne's Lucky Country has antecedents, and I'm particularly aware of Keith Hancock's great book of 1930 Australia and John Douglas Pringle's 1958 Australian Accent. What debt did Horne have to those predecessors of his? And I've just selected 2 particularly relatively well-known ones. And why is it the Lucky Country which has flourished, but those other 2, amongst others, have absolutely faded from consciousness?
Graham? I think actually Horne's model, I mean, Stuart Ward argued this well in his most recent book, but the model was actually British State of the Nation books. In the early 1960s, there was a flood of what's wrong with Britain books, I think Stuart called them. And they were essentially, I mean, there was one, Anatomy of England, that I think was explicitly referenced by Geoffrey Dutton when he was kind of commissioning Horne to write the book. We want like an Australian version of the Anatomy of England. More broadly, sorry, what was the second part of your question? Oh, yes, yeah.
In their day, and certain historians will still refer to Hancock as the foundational book of Australian culture. Yeah. But what basically they've forgotten.
I'll have a go at that. And then
yeah, it's an unanswerable question.
well, I think it is an answerable question to some degree, but I can't answer about why the others become less visible. But it's like, you know, in the marketplace of ideas, you know, books become invisible, they become operate a niche, and then they disappear. On my rough calculation, since the beginning of the 21st century, there's been something like 500,000 books published in Australia, and there's not many of them you can probably name off the top of your head. But by the by, I think that one of the really crucial things about the success of Lucky Country was that collaboration with Harris and Dutton. And Harris, as the literary editor of The Australian, was able, in the 6-month-old Australian of the time, to have extracts from the book published. And that was it was a sort of galvanising moment in terms of that publication. You know, the early reviews were, you know, in many places were very negative, but it connected with an audience that, in a way, the best of that early Australian was also connecting with. And so I think that the skill that Harris particularly, and Dutton to some degree, brought to that sort of marketing of the book meant that it was probably the first book that we saw in Australia, in modern Australia, that actually had the full weight of a sort of media machine behind it to actually push it out there and find its own audience.
I think one of the other things is that, you know, people weren't just reading books about Australia, that was dealing with that kind of broad-based cultural analysis. You know, when I was at university in 1964, I wasn't just reading The Lucky Country and its predecessors, and just as an aside, I find it far more interesting than the ones that you've mentioned that came before it, because it had that breadth and it had a level of I suppose, opinionation that made it bracing. But the other books I was reading at the time were things like Raymond Williams' Culture and Society and Richard Hoggett's The Uses of Literacy, very different historicised accounts of a culture and how it has developed, very different from Horne, but also leading to a whole range of other ways of thinking about culture and society that Horne represented better than any of his predecessors.
And Horne was working as an ad executive when the book came out. He was a pretty good ideas salesman himself. And I mean, he was also, so in the years between Pringle's book coming out and Lucky Country coming out, like he edited the Observer magazine and then the Bulletin. And so there was very much a kind of milieu of writers who thought in a similar, well, there was a kind of discussion. He always thought of those magazines as like a forum for debate. And so the Lucky Country was criticised, as Julianne points out, for kind of, not having particularly, like these debates have already been had, these arguments have already been made in the fortnightlies. And Horne was like, well, that's the point, right? I'm popularising the ideas. I'm crystallising this debate, I'm capturing it, and giving it wings, right? And I think that probably is the key, right? That he had that ability to sell the ideas that he was talking about.
Thanks. Okay, we've got two questions lined up now. First one to Frank.
Thanks, Shirley. Yeah, Frank Bongiorno, ANU. Looking at the discontent side of this, so the failings of the political class, of politicians, of bureaucrats, problems in the media. But I'm struck when I read The Lucky Country that so much of the book is about a whole bunch of civil society organisations, institutions that are now, if not dead, in really, really appalling condition in terms of their decline. You know, you can go through them one by one. A union movement that in his time accounted for over half the working population or the paid workers, you know, compared with, I don't know, coverage of whatever it is today, 12% or something. Churches, service clubs, a whole range. And I just wonder to what extent the difficulties, if you like, of coming to grips with the nation as an, you know, analytically, and also, you know, just a sense of a lack of national direction or of you know, the problems that exist, if you like, within our culture to do with the ways in which those kind of intervening or civil society institutions have declined.
A couple of answers to that. I mean, I think we underestimate the impact of neoliberalism on the actual structures of our community. That once you shift towards a position that sees the individual as the centre of everything and moves the community and the public good aside, there are all kind of consequences that flow from that, and it's taken, you know, 30, 40 years for that to happen. And so it just slowly eroded the kind of structures that you were talking about. On the more positive side, I was involved in a research project in recent years where we were looking at cultural consumption within Australia. And one of the things that we did when we were doing interviews with people was talk about the kind of activities they undertook. And that included, you know, being involved in a church or a local sporting organisation, not just, you know, what books do you read or do you go to the movies very often. And what we found was that although there were lots of interesting things at this level of cultural consumption that were about cultural products, that what remained strong was that sense of community around location and family, that exactly the kinds of things you're talking about, that managed to persist despite all the pressures to the contrary, you know, which, you know, I know my talk wasn't particularly hopeful, but if I was going to be hopeful, what I would look to would be the strength of those communities and the notion of family as having a real sense of continuity. But also, I think peoples have started to accept that it's kind of up to them. You know, that they're stuck with useless governments. They're stuck with a model of behaviour that is organised around profit and money, and that all the other things that matter to them are going to have to be done by themselves. And we got a bit of a sense of that from those interviews. But you know, like I said, it's hard. I mean, it's become such a kind of routine way to talk about neoliberalism as being really destructive. I think we massively underestimate the way in which that has changed the structure of our communities, the way in which we think about ourselves, and the way in which we relate to each other. And it's going to take years to turn that around.
It's Marilyn Lake from the University of Melbourne. I wanted to follow up on the question about where is Hancock's Australia in this, because what struck me when I've been rereading The Lucky Country, really struck me, is Donald Horne's complete lack of knowledge of Australian history, of the founding years, you know, of the Commonwealth. He always talks about Australia as a place of received ideas, that we're derivative, we derive everything from overseas. And then at the other hand, though, he constantly goes on about our level of unequaled equality in the 1960s and prosperity. And to take up a point Frank made, there's seemingly no recognition of the part things like the arbitration court and award wages played in all of this, you know. There's a sort of complete gap in his analysis. And I was really struck by his complete lack of knowledge of how innovative Australia was as a social democracy. You know, so nowhere there is the arbitration court or the living wage or minimum wages or payment to members of parliament or old age and invalid pensions or the maternity allowance and all of those things that uniquely in Australia came out of general revenue. You know, all of these innovations in social democracy that actually laid the basis for that very prosperity he was eulogising in the 1950s and 60s. It's extremely odd.
I agree with you, Marilyn. And it's interesting that he talks about, the level of income and the level, all of those things. This is like this great utopian sort of moment, but actually doesn't at any point describe the contest that led to that being achieved. So, yeah, there is a sort of a blank there.
He was a kind of Cold War liberal in that sense. Him and a lot of similar thinkers of that generation had kind of convinced themselves that capitalism had been reformed out of existence. The mixed economy and 20 years of post-war prosperity and this kind of thing. On the other hand, I don't think you can discount his polemical intent. He was trying to provoke, and if his intention was to kind of shake Australia out of some kind of stupor, then he would hammer that point home. He wasn't kind of going to mess around with facts like history. But I mean, and the other thing is that I was going to say that a lot of the best history was produced after that book came out, right? The great professionalisation and flourishing of the historical profession, and Horne was really engaged with that, as that emerged, right? But in the 60s, yeah, it's a different perspective.
Okay, thanks for that. We have an online question. From Francesca Betty, and we have an in-the-room question. So if you wouldn't mind just running the microphone down here. Thank you. Okay, so the question from Francesca is, Ryan, thank you for these provocations. Is there a paradox in the rise of xenophobia we see at the same time as the weakening of the idea of Australian discussion? More Australian flags and capes on Australia Day, the distortion of Anzac Day, bolder white supremacist displays.
Well, it's probably part of the same phenomenon, right, of algorithms kind of producing more extreme outcomes and just accentuating the culture wars. I mean, that would be how I would explain that aspect. I don't know, what do you guys think?
I think that part of it is, that's Jingo, the Aussie oi crowd is how I describe it. That sort of flag waving notion of Australian identity. I mean, I don't think that you can underestimate, and many of you felt this very acutely, but you can't underestimate the power of the damage that was done, and I think it does tie back to the sort of neoliberal stuff that Graham's been talking about, but the power of the damage that was done during those years of those culture wars. They weren't just a bit of a sport on the side, they really were going to the fabric of the society. And Howard's, repeated statement, we're sick of endless seminars on Australian identity, and I will give you my own, my own version that you can hang on to, really did a huge amount of, it reset the game in a sense. And I mean, he did that quite deliberately. One of the, I was just reminded as we were doing some interviews for the TV thing the other day, and somebody who'd had long interviews with Howard, and he said, "Oh no, what I wanted to do, I really felt terrible I felt angry that the left and the Labor Party owned the legends of Australia. And I set myself the task of reclaiming and remaking the legends in a way that would give me more purchase for an individualised sort of notion of the nation." And that's what you see, you can buy a flag, or maybe you can't buy it at Woolworths this year because actually there's not much of a market in it. I don't know.
Thanks. Have a microphone back here.
Hello. My name is Pedro from the Research School of Social Sciences, right here. Thank you for the conversation, it's very interesting. I was thinking, it seems to me that the situation in Australia, I can maybe call it like an identity crisis. You said 60, 70 years ago, there was this idea okay, we are not British, we're Australians. And there was a movement about it. My question is multiculturalism like an attempt to find a new national identity? And I ask this, obviously I'm not Australian, I'm an international student, so when I came here the first time, the only thing I knew about Australia was Crocodile Dundee boomerangs, kangaroos, opera house, like the usual suspects. So, but when I came here, I found like many nationalities, like Chinese students, people from Latin America, and etc. And I was like, okay, so, and I realized that like the discourse, it was like, this is a multicultural society. But sometimes when I talk with Australian-born, whatever, Chinese, Hindi, Latin American, and I say, oh, so this is a multicultural society, sometimes I get a very angry reaction. So it's like, okay, maybe it's not a multicultural society as they sell it to international students like me. And yeah, so is multiculturalism like an attempt to reach some kind of national identity? Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm not a big fan of theories of national identity. I see national identity as a political activity that definitions of the nation are kind of vacant until they're filled up by politicians. I'm more interested in the construction of a society that is just and equitable. And I think if you're able to build a society within which you feel your personal belonging is valid and justified, then you know the arguments about national identity become kind of secondary. So I know that there's been a long debate about what is Australia, what's an Australian identity, and you know, it's very easy to pick that out, say, in a sporting crowd, like Julianne says, you just have to listen to it to know where the Australians are. And, when you travel overseas, one of the games is, that Australians have a particular mode of dressing when they're travelling overseas. And when you're in I've just come back from a trip overseas, so I spent a lot of time in airport queues. And the game, whilst you're waiting for an hour to get through that queue, is pick out the Australians, It's not hard. They're wearing shorts and thongs and usually 4X t-shirts. So, look, I don't want to be facetious about it. It does seem to me that worrying about national identity before you've sorted out the society is a waste of time. And I would be focusing on restoring social justice and equity to our society. And that's something that's, I think, a major challenge.
Look, I think I agree with what you're saying, Graham. One of the things that I think is really interesting in terms of the sort of whole multiculturalism discussion is that we've wrapped ourselves, it's like the new myth, that the best, my line of former Liberal Prime Ministers, Malcolm Turnbull always used to say, Australia's the best little multicultural country in the world. And then, there'd be endless examples of how, in practice, that at one level it was fine as people were bumping along, but when you got to another level, it wasn't actually quite as robust and resilient as he would have liked us all to believe. And I think so. I think one of the things that, and this goes back to the sort of role of the media, the humanities, and others, is the Australian population is now 30 million thereabouts, near enough, a bit short, but getting close to 30 million people. Of them, half are either overseas born or the descendants of people who were born overseas. So the active process of both valuing people as individuals and their families and enabling them to make connections and flourish in this society is step number one, irrespective of where they've come from. The second is that opening the lines of communication both ways, so that process of hearing stories, of learning what it is that, where people have come from, what's brought them here, what they're hoping for, what their dreams and aspirations might be, but also telling the old stories. I mean, as Marilyn mentioned before, even in that book, Horne didn't really tell the old stories of Australia's formation. So telling that story is one of the pathways to actually giving people a sense of belonging, and it works both ways. So the level of, we know this from the surveys, and you must know it from your work, but the level of just general ignorance in the community about this nation and its formation is extraordinary. I mean, it is truly extraordinary. We were doing filming for this TV thing the other day, and we did a series of vox pops around the Federation Dome in Centennial Park. So it's in the middle of Sydney, beautiful space, opened bizarrely, why do you open a memorial to Federation during a commemoration of the landing of the First Fleet? But, you know, nonetheless, we can get confused about dates. So we asked all these people walking around the Federation Dome. So this is the middle of eastern suburb of Sydney. Do you know what this building is? No, I don't, but I always like to feed give my dog water here. Do you know anything about Australian history? Little young man, parents probably spending $50,000 a year on his education, said, no, I don't. I think it was Captain Cook arrived with a bunch of crooks. Is that right? Next person, what do you think? Two middle-aged women. Oh, well, they started reciting the opening of the American independence, the American Constitution, you know, we the people, you know, freedom of speech, blah, blah. And a friend says, I think that's the American one. A man who looks like a lawyer, but obviously he wasn't a lawyer because he wouldn't have said, have we got a constitution? I don't know, that's probably a really good, this is the middle of eastern suburb Sydney, 6 months after the referendum, which has been about changing a constitution. They didn't have a clue, you know. So the level of ignorance in terms of building nation, you've got to have story, you've got to imagine, you've got to know what's come before, and then you can create a pathway. If you don't know it, what can you do?
I also think, just the direct answer to your question is yes. Various prime ministers and other senior leaders have tried to use multiculturalism as a kind of replacement national myth for Britishness. And I don't think it has the same purchase, because nationalism as a kind of phenomenon, you know, that developed in the late 19th century was kind of by its nature exclusive, and usually racially exclusive, almost always, right? And so the kind of paradox for Horne's generation, who were trying to kind of reinvent the nation as a kind of inclusive and diverse place, was that it kind of contained the seeds of its own demise, because, you know, the nation was everything and nothing, right? Multiculturalism is, you can't draw a circle around the kind of people that belong to this nation and say this is them. So I think that's why that particular, you know, replacement myth just hasn't really caught hold, or doesn't have the same romantic purchase on national imagination.
I really like the Tim Garton-Ash stuff on that. I mean, that nations can actually be reimagined as inclusive and you know, inclusive of people and the environment and everything else. I mean, you know, you don't have to be stuck with a 19th century notion of nation. You can actually, it can be reinvented.
Thank you. Now we have a question in the middle.
Hi, my name's Leslie Head, University of Melbourne. Thanks to the panel. I thought Marie and then Julianne and then Graham spoke in really interesting ways about self-determination for the humanities and their future. Marie, and it's a pity she had to leave, but drawing on Indigenous modes of knowledge and governance. So thank you for that kind of inspiration in the ashes of the university system around us, as all sorts of trashing is happening this very week. But I wonder if you could say a bit more about that kind of future for the humanities and the keeping of the flame, intellectual life generally in these kind of very difficult times.
Now that's a great question, but I have to say to our panel, it's a huge one. So we're looking to, I'm getting the nod from the back of the room that they'd like us to wind up within the next minute. So can I just have a very quick response to that rather large question, and then suggest that we continue the discussion over coffee? So, yeah, over to you, Graham.
I'd like to quote Donald Trump and say, fight, fight, fight. I think that it's the difficulties the humanities face is constitutive. It never changes. And I think we've got to forget the hope that it might change and really commit to keep on pushing as hard as we can in as many ways as we can to maintain public value in the humanities.
Thanks, Graham. Julianne?
Yeah, I agree. And I would just like to commend the University of Melbourne's work on reinterrogating its own history in terms of Indigenous, you know, its complicity with the whole project over the last, 200 years. I think that first book that's been published, and then the new exhibition that we open next year, are a fantastic example of how the university can engage with the most one of the most pressing issues in the nation, and really bring it to a broader audience in a really important way.
Thanks, Julianne. And Ryan?
I did a reverse Donald Horne and went from academia to journalism. So I don't think I'm allowed to comment.
Of course you are, but on that note, please join me in thanking all our panellists once again.